Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. Now, in our previous lecture, we started talking about money market equilibrium. Today, my expectation is that we will be able to conclude our discussion on money market equilibrium, and then together with a representation for the goods market equilibrium, we will be able to talk about the ISLM framework for joint equilibrium determination in the goods and money markets. Originally, I had thought that maybe part of today's lecture, the latter part, could have been devoted to a discussion of international trade and finance issues, but it seems that will have to wait till our next lecture. So let's turn to our discussion about money market equilibrium from where we left it in our previous lecture. Now, if you recall, we talked about the two determinants of money demand, real money demand, which we represented by the alphabet L. And we said that the two determinants were the real interest rate, which was denoted by I, small I, and the level of real income, which was denoted by Y, capital Y. And then we drew the demand curve, the money demand curve in IM space, where M stood for money and I stood for the real interest rate. Real money, M was real money. And we saw that the money demand curve was a downward sloping line. And shifts in this demand curve would be caused by shifts in real income, because real income was not being shown on the vertical axis. That is, therefore, any change in real income would cause us to shift the demand curve, the money demand curve, to the right, whereas changes in the interest rate would cause us to move along the money demand curve. And this is consistent with what we have learned earlier and how we've applied demand and supply concepts earlier. Let's now talk about the supply side in the monetary sector. And again, the point to note is that we will talk about real money supply and not nominal money supply. So we will have to divide M by P. Remember that equation MV is equal to PQ. So you can think of the P on the right-hand side coming as the denominator on the left-hand side to give you M over P, and that gives you the real money supply in the economy. Let's see how the real money supply curve can be drawn in IM space, and then this will enable us to look at how equilibrium is determined in the money market. Let's go to our first slide for today. There are going to be a number of slides today because there are a lot of graphical illustrations involved, so be patient. Let's go to our first slide. Now, the point to note here is that the money supply is fixed by the central bank, and if the price level is taken as fixed, then the central bank, which fixes the nominal money supply, will also be able to fix the real money supply. And taking that assumption forward, how will the money supply curve be drawn in IM space? Well, as long as the money supply is fixed, it does not need to respond to the interest rate, right? Because the money supply is assumed to be totally determined by the central bank. Therefore, we can draw the real money supply curve as a vertical line in IM space. And the point at which it is vertical, or where it intersects the x-axis, that is the m-axis, will determine the money supply at that particular point. So as you can see in this diagram, we have M1 as the money supply curve for the economy. Then let's say there is an increase in money supply, either caused by an increase in items 1, 2, or 3 in the central bank's balance sheet, or by a reduction in items 5 and 6 in the central bank's balance sheet. And these will all cause a rightward shift in the money supply curve. Alternatively, you could think of the reserve ratio going down, or the statutory liquidity requirements going down. These will also shift the money supply curve from M1 to M2. The reverse of this would happen when there is a decrease in either of items 1, 2, or 3 on the asset side of the central bank, or there is an increase in items 5 or 6. And all of these factors will cause a leftward shift in the money supply curve. So the money supply curve will shift from M1 to something like M3. Note that an increase in the reserve ratio, that is a fall in the money multiplier, will produce the same effect. Let's now see how we can combine these two curves, the L curve, which stands for the demand, the real demand for money, and the M curve, which stands for the real supply of money in IM space. The point of intersection of these two curves should determine the equilibrium point in the money market. So let's go to our next slide, which is about money market equilibrium in the IM space. Now let's look at this graph where we have M1 as the real money supply curve and L1 as the real money demand curve. We have the interest rate, the real interest rate I on the vertical axis, and we have the demand and supply of money on the horizontal axis. Note that equilibrium will be reached at the intersection of the L1 and M1 curves, that is at point E1, and at this point the money supply is simply M1, whereas the equilibrium interest rate is I1. Now it's useful to think about how this situation would change if there was an increase in income. How would an increase in income be shown here? Yes, it would be shown by a rightward shift in the money demand curve. So L1 would shift to something like L2, and this would cause the equilibrium interest rate to rise from I1 to I2. So this is the effect that a rise in income Y has on the level of the interest rate in the money market. Similarly, you can think of the effect of a fall in income. What happens in this case? Well, in this case, we'll have a leftward shift in the money demand curve. So you'll move from L1 to L3, and equilibrium will move from E1 to E3, and this is consistent with an interest rate level of I3. That means interest rates have fallen. Now let's think about the intuition behind this increase in interest rate, which is the result of an increase in income. Now when the income level increases, there is an increase in the demand for money. And you could think of it in the context of transactions demand for money. That's the easiest. The more income people have, the more transactions they would like to make, and therefore the more money they would like to keep in their pockets. But note that when their money demand increases, there is an excess demand in the market, an excess demand for cash, for liquidity in the market, whereas the supply of money is fixed by the central bank. So how should this excess demand for money be removed? Because in equilibrium, the demand for money should be exactly equal to the supply of money. Now, if you remember, we introduced the real interest rate as the opportunity cost of holding money in your pocket. So if the demand for money, the excess demand for money, is to be removed and brought back to its original level where it is equal to the money supply, which is being determined by the central bank, in order for this reduction in money demand to take place, the opportunity cost of holding money in your pockets must increase. And this is why the interest rate rises in order to ensure equilibrium in the money market. The reverse argument would apply when there is a fall in income. When income falls, money demand falls, and therefore there is an excess of money supply in the market. And in order to remove that excess supply, money demand must rise. How can it rise? It will rise by lowering the opportunity cost of holding money in your pockets. So the real interest rate must fall. So this is why a change in income causes a countervailing or compensating change in the interest rate. Now the important thing for us is how we can represent these changes that we've seen in IY space. That is, how can we represent the money market equilibrium in the interest rate real income space? Because this is the space which will enable us to look at the ISLM approach to obtaining the joint equilibrium in the economy. So let's look at how we can represent the money market equilibrium in this IY space. And this will also help us introduce the LM curve, where L stands for money demand and M stands for money supply. Let's go to our slide. Now, as you can see from the top graph, my friends, an increase in income causes a higher interest rate to obtain in the money market. That means that there is a positive relationship between income and the interest rate. And this can simply be plotted in IY space as the LM curve. Note that here E1, E2 and E3 correspond to the three interest rate levels I1, I2 and I3 respectively, and that the increase in income which caused the demand curve, the money demand curve L1 to shift to L2, that is when Y1 rose to Y2, is now shown as the income levels which link points E1 to E2. Now let's talk about what determines the slope of the LM curve, because this is a question that will come up later and it's an important question for policy. Well, the slope of the LM curve depends on two factors. It depends on the responsiveness of money demand to interest rates, and it depends on the responsiveness of money demand to changes in income. Now, it's actually simpler than it sounds. Let's first tackle the first one. If the responsiveness of money demand to interest rates is high, then all it means is that the L curves will be flatter. They will be more elastic. Therefore, any small change in interest rate will cause a large change in money demand. This means that any large change in income will cause only a small rightward shift or a small upward shift in the L curve, and therefore produce very small changes in interest rates. Therefore, as you can see, I1, I2 prime and I3 prime are far more closely bunched together than were I1, I2 and I3. And this means that the LM curve will be flatter when drawn in IY space. That is, even a large change in Y will only cause a small change in I. What's the other determinant of the slope of the LM curve? This is the responsiveness of money demand to income. And this is related to how much the L curve shifts to the right when there is an increase in Y. So it's possible for a very large increase in Y to be associated with a very small increase in money demand. In that case, as you can see, the L1 curve might shift to L2 prime when there is an increase in income, a very large increase in income, and might shift to L3 prime when there is a very large fall in income. And this is simply how you assume the money demand function, or how you assume money demand responds to changes in income, right? So what would be the effect on interest rates in this case? Again, you will note that when you have L1, L2 prime and L3 prime close to each other, the equilibrium points will be close to each other as well. And therefore, the interest rates that you will get will also be bunched closer together. The result of this will also be to produce a more flat LM curve. That is, an LM curve which is not too steep. That is, where a large increase in Y is associated with only a small increase in I. So, my friends, the higher the responsiveness of money demand to the interest rate, the flatter will be the LM curve. And the lower the responsiveness of the money demand to income, the flatter will be the LM curve. So those two are the determinants of the slope of the LM curve. If, for example, you have a lower responsiveness of money demand to interest rates, that will be consistent with a steeper LM curve. Similarly, if you have a high responsiveness of money demand to income, that will also be consistent with a steeper LM curve. Now, we've talked about the slope of the LM curve. Let's now talk about the factors which can bring about shifts in the LM curve. Let's go back to an illustration. Now, shifts in the LM curve will be caused by shifts in the money supply. Let's see how. In the top graph, you see that when the money supply is M1 and when the money demand curve is given by L, you have equilibrium at E1 prime. Now let's see what happens when money supply increases from M1 to M2. The corresponding change in interest rate is from I1 prime to I2 prime. That is, the interest rate falls. Similarly, when the money supply goes down from M1 to M3, the interest rate increases from I1 prime to I3 prime. So an increase in the money supply causes interest rates to fall, and a decrease in money supply causes interest rates to rise. Now, what's the intuition behind an increase in the money supply being associated with a fall in interest rates? I'll give you a very simple answer to this. Money is something, and when the supply of something goes up, what happens to its price? the price falls. So it's the same case here. When the supply of money goes up, its price falls. What's its price? Its price is simply the interest rate. Similarly, when the supply of money becomes less, that is when money becomes short, then its demand, not the demand, its price goes up. So that is what explains why an increase in the supply of money will cause a fall in the interest rates, and an increase or a decrease in the supply of money will cause a rise in the interest rates. Because we have held prices fixed, we can think of these as real changes. That is, a real change in money supply causing a real change in the real interest rate. Let's now go back and see how this can be represented in IY space, and see if this indeed does represent the shifts in the LM curve that we wanted to get at. Let's go back to our slide. Now, the important thing to note about the graph that is shown here is that all these different interest rates, I1 prime, I2 prime, and I3 prime, are being obtained for the same level of income. That is, income has not changed, because if income had changed, the L curve would have shifted. But we have all these different equilibrium points on the same L curve. So when you represent this in IY space, all you need to do is to draw a vertical line at some value of y and see how different points of interest rates can be obtained by drawing different LM curves. And therefore, automatically you are in the realm of shifting LM curves. So equilibrium point E1 prime is obtained when income is y and the interest rate is I1 prime. Equilibrium point E2 prime is obtained when the income level is y and the interest rate is I2 prime. And equilibrium level E3 prime is obtained when the interest rate is I3 prime and the income is y. So a rightward shift in the LM curve is caused by an increase in the money supply, whereas a leftward shift in the LM curve is caused by a decrease in the money supply. So that, my friends, was the LM curve. We've looked at the determinants which cause the slope of the LM curve to increase or decrease, and we've looked at the factors which cause rightwards or leftward shifts in the LM curve. Let's now look at the goods market and see how the goods market equilibrium can be captured in IY space. The first thing that comes to mind is, why is the goods market equilibrium line being called the IS curve, as I've written it here? Well, the argument that was given initially was that I stands for investment and S stands for saving. And the argument was that when the goods market is in equilibrium, investments equal savings, or at least planned investments equal planned savings. Let's look at how this plays out in the context of the old aggregate demand equations that we introduced earlier. That is, Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Let's go to a slide. Now, equilibrium in the goods market would be obtained when aggregate demand is equal to income or aggregate supply. Now, what was aggregate demand? That was simply equal to C plus I plus G plus NX. Whereas income can be written as what consumers consume, how much of the income he saves, and how much he pays in taxes. That is, income is equal to C plus S plus T. Now, when aggregate demand is equal to aggregate supply or income, we can simply equate the two equations. So we can write C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where X minus M is simply NX, is equal to C plus S plus T. C cancels out, and by a little rearranging, we can produce this equation where G minus T plus X minus M plus I is equal to S. Now, assuming G is equal to T, that is, the government is running a balanced budget, and X is equal to M, that is, we have exports equal to imports and there is no current account surplus or deficit. Now, if those two terms are zero, then as you can see, investments equal savings. And this is the condition for equilibrium in the goods market. Now, in order to obtain the IS representation of the goods market equilibrium in IY space, we need to introduce or go back to two graphs that we talked about earlier. Those graphs are: 1, the 45-degree line diagram, which relates aggregate demand on the vertical axis to income on the horizontal axis, and the loanable funds market graph, which related investment and saving to the interest rate, where investment generated the demand for loanable funds and saving generated the supply for loanable funds. So let's see how the interaction of these two diagrams can help us come up with the IS curve in IY space. Here we have the familiar 45-degree line diagram, where we have the aggregate demand curve AD naught intersecting the 45-degree line at E naught. So equilibrium income is Y naught. The equation for aggregate demand AD naught is equal to C plus I naught plus G plus NX. Let's now see what happens when there is a fall in the interest rate. In particular, we are interested on the impact that a fall in the interest rate has on investment spending by firms. For this, we refer to the loanable funds market, where you have the interest rate on the vertical axis and investment and savings on the horizontal axis. And as you can see, the investment line, the investment curve, plots as a downward sloping curve because it's the demand curve for loanable funds. Therefore, a cut in the interest rate will cause an increase in the investment demand of firms from I0 to I1. Now, how will this be represented in the 45-degree line diagram? It will be represented by AD1, that is an upward shift in the aggregate demand curve. So the new aggregate demand curve will be C plus I1 plus G plus NX. Note that all other variables are thought of as constant, only the investment variable changes, or the investment component of demand changes. Now this move to the new aggregate demand curve will cause equilibrium to shift from E0 to E1. That is, there will be an increase in the equilibrium income from Y0 to Y1. Now, how do you plot this information in IY space? You can plot this simply by looking at the impact a reduction in the interest rate has had on the equilibrium income. Interest rate fell from I0 to I1, whereas income rose from Y0 to Y1. That means that there is an inverse relationship between the real interest rate and income. Therefore, the IS curve, which represents the goods market equilibrium, will plot as a downward sloping curve, as is shown here. So we've looked at how the IS curve will be shaped. It will be a downward sloping curve in IY space, and it captures all the points at which the goods market is in equilibrium. Note that a higher interest rate is associated with a lower level of output or income, whereas a lower interest rate is associated with a higher level of output or income. And the main factor which is causing this relationship or driving this relationship is investment demand. A higher interest rate causes investment demand to contract. A lower interest rate causes investment demand to expand. Now, this is about the shape of the IS curve. Let's talk about what factors determine the slope of the IS curve, that is, whether it is flat or steep, and what factors cause the IS curve to shift either to the right or to the left. Let's illustrate using some more graphs. The first factor which determines the slope of the IS curve is the Keynesian multiplier K that we introduced earlier. Now, the Keynesian multiplier K, if you remember, is simply 1 over 1 minus MPC, where MPC is the marginal propensity to consume. The higher the MPC, the higher will be the Keynesian multiplier, or the higher will be the value of K. But note that the MPC is also the slope of the aggregate demand curve in the 45-degree line diagram, right? So what happens when the MPC increases, that is, when the multiplier increases? When the MPC increases, there is a tilt in the aggregate demand curve, so that we can imagine AD0 tilting to AD0 prime and AD1 tilting to AD1 prime. Note that for the same vertical shift in the aggregate demand curve, you now have a larger increase in equilibrium income. That is, equilibrium income now moves from y0 to y1 prime. And this is mainly because the size of the multiplier has increased. Note that we have not increased the vertical distance by which the aggregate demand AD0 curve moves up. The vertical distance is the same, but the impact horizontally has increased. Now, when you plot this information in IY space, you note that the interest rate fall that caused the aggregate demand curve to shift vertically is still the same, right? The investment impact is still the same. However, the change in income is higher. Therefore, the IS curve will be flatter. That is, the equilibrium point E1 prime will occur to the right of equilibrium point E1, which we obtained earlier with the less steeply sloped aggregate demand curve. The other factor which determines the slope of the IS curve is the responsiveness of investment demand to the real interest rate. That is, what is the slope of the demand curve in the loanable funds market. Note that if the demand curve is highly elastic, that is, if investment is very responsive to a cut in the interest rate, then a cut from I0 to I1 will cause an increase in investment demand from I0 to I1 prime. Now, when you plot this effect in the 45-degree line diagram, you'll find that the aggregate demand curve now shifts by more. That is, AD0 does not now move to AD1, it moves to AD1 double prime, which is given by C plus I1 prime plus G plus NX. This now produces equilibrium at E1 double prime, and this is consistent with an equilibrium income of Y1 double prime. So an increase in the responsiveness of investment to a cut in the interest rate has caused the output or income impact of the lower interest rate to increase. And therefore, this is also consistent with a flatter IS curve. Note that equilibrium now is reached not at E1 but at E1 double prime, where equilibrium income is Y1 double prime and the equilibrium interest rate is I1. So the two determinants of the slope of the IS curve are K, the Keynesian multiplier. The higher the value of the multiplier, the flatter the IS curve, and the responsiveness of investment to interest rates. The higher the responsiveness of investment to changes in the interest rate, the flatter the IS curve. By contrast, if the Keynesian multiplier is lower, or if the responsiveness of investment to interest rate changes is lower, the IS curve will be steeper. Now, that was a discussion about the slope of the IS curve. What about shifts in the IS curve? Just as we discussed in the case of the LM curve, we need to talk about what factors could cause shifts in the IS curve. Well, the way to think about it would be to draw a horizontal line in IY space at some interest rate level and see whether it was possible for the IS curve to shift to the right, that is at that same interest rate level. And you need to think about what are the factors, what are the components of the aggregate demand curve or the aggregate demand equation which could increase without being driven by a higher interest rate. That is, in the earlier case we had investment increased because the interest rate fell. But now let's think about the other components which might increase without changing the interest rate. So let's think about government spending. Does government spending need to be prompted by a change in the interest rate? Does there need to be a change in the interest rate in order for the government to spend more? Similarly, net exports. Do we need a higher interest rate or a lower interest rate in order to induce more net exports? That is, to have exports greater than imports? No. Similarly, changes in autonomous consumption can happen without needing an underlying change in the interest rate. So all these factors can cause the IS curve to shift to the right or to the left, that is, at all levels of interest rate. That is, the IS curve can shift to the right because of an increase in government spending, can shift to the right because of an increase in net exports. Note that those are the two components of aggregate demand. So higher net exports and higher government spending will cause the IS curve to shift to the right. Similarly, a decline in, let's say, autonomous consumption, or a decline in net exports, or a decline in government spending could cause the IS curve to shift to the left. So those are the factors which could cause shifts in the IS curve. Now that we have developed an idea of what factors cause shifts in the IS curve, what factors cause shifts in the LM curve, we also know why these curves are sloped the way they are, the LM curve being an upward sloping curve, the IS curve being a downward sloping curve. We can develop the concept of joint equilibrium in the money and goods markets. And this we'll do within the IS-LM framework. That is, we have the interest rate on the vertical axis and income on the horizontal axis. Now, where, in your opinion, will the joint equilibrium obtain? Yes, at the intersection of the IS and LM curves. Why do you think that will be the case? No, wrong answer. It is not because the LM curve is like a supply curve and the IS curve is like a demand curve. No, not at all. The answer is that the IS curve is the combination of all the points, all the combinations of interest rate and output or income in which or on which the goods market is in equilibrium. Whereas the LM curve is a set of all points at which the money market is in equilibrium. And therefore, there has to be a unique point at which both curves intersect, which gives the point at which there is joint equilibrium in the goods market and money market. The intuition is very similar to when we discussed the Salter-Swan diagram, where we had internal balance and external balance curves. And the point of equilibrium for the economy as a whole was where the two curves intersected. Again, we had the exchange rate there on the vertical axis and the absorption or government spending on the horizontal axis. And it was not that one of those curves was the supply curve and the other curve was the demand curve. No, there were different concepts. One curve, the internal balance line, captured all the points where the aggregate demand was equal to aggregate supply in the domestic economy. Whereas the external balance line captured all those points where the external sector was in equilibrium, where the balance of payments was in equilibrium. And it was the intersection of those 2 points which determined the joint equilibrium in the external sector and the domestic sector. The same intuition applies here. The IS curve is the set of all points in which the goods market is in equilibrium, whereas the LM curve represents all the combinations at which the money market is in equilibrium. Now, what's the next step in our analysis? The next step is to see if we can develop some intelligent ideas about how fiscal policy and monetary policy will operate in an IS-LM framework. How can we represent an expansion in the money supply, for example? What will be the effect of a change in government spending? Now, you will note that we have already talked about those issues in the context of shifts in the LM and IS curves. That is, an increase in the money supply, which is an action of monetary policy, will cause the LM curve to shift to the right, whereas an increase in government spending will cause the IS curve to shift to the right. So we can think intelligently about what would happen to the joint equilibrium in the economy when either fiscal policy is at play or monetary policy. Let's illustrate this through the use of some slides. We start by looking at the equilibrium representation in an IS-LM framework. That is simply where the LM and IS curves intersect, and here it is shown with point E, where equilibrium income is Y star and equilibrium interest rate is I star. Now, if we want to talk about monetary policy, we can think about a rightward shift in the LM curve caused by an expansion in the money supply. What happens to the equilibrium? Now, let's say we started at the equilibrium point E1 in this new graph, and now an increase in the money supply has taken us to LM2 and equilibrium level or equilibrium point E2. That is, we'll move along the IS curve. What will happen to the interest rate? The interest rate at the new equilibrium will be I2. That is, there has been a fall in interest rates, whereas equilibrium income has increased from Y1 to Y2. So in the ISLM framework, any increase in money supply will cause equilibrium income to increase and the equilibrium interest rate to fall. Now, what's the intuition behind this? Why does an increase in the money supply cause aggregate output to expand? And how are these effects working through the goods market? Well, the answer is simple. When money supply expands, the real interest rate falls, assuming that prices are fixed. And so far, we've assumed that prices are fixed. Therefore, an increase in the money supply means that there's an increase in the real money supply, which causes a fall in the real interest rate. When the real interest rate falls, what happens in the goods market? Well, the simple thing that happens is that investment demand increases, right? And refer to the loanable funds market, where you had the interest rate on the vertical axis and the demand for investment and the supply of savings on the horizontal axis. So when investment demand increases, that causes the aggregate demand curve to shift vertically upwards in the 45-degree line diagram. And that causes equilibrium output or income to increase. This is what is causing the equilibrium income to increase when there is an increase in the money supply. Let's now look at how fiscal policy would operate in this framework. Now, let's assume that there is an increase in government spending. That is, the IS curve in this diagram shifts from IS1 to IS2. This causes the equilibrium to move from E1 to E2, and the interest rate to increase from I1 to I2, and equilibrium income to increase from Y1 to Y2. An interesting point to note here is that what would have been the effect on income if the LM curve were horizontal? So think of the LM curve as a horizontal curve connecting I1 and E3, and see what would happen to equilibrium income. If you had a change in G, that would now take equilibrium from E1 to E3, and equilibrium income would increase to Y3. So the fact that the LM curve is positively sloped and that there is an increase in the interest rate when there is an increase in government spending tells us something about the negative effects of the higher interest rate. That is, the negative effects of having a positively sloped LM curve. Now, the reason that a higher interest rate does not permit the equilibrium income to increase from Y1 to Y3 is because of crowding out effects. And I think we talked about it earlier as well. Let's talk a little bit about what this means. When aggregate demand increases, there is an increase in the interest rate. Now, what are the effects of this increase in the interest rate? The first effect, obviously, is that investment demand is discouraged. And this is one reason why equilibrium income does not increase as much. So this is a kind of a contractionary effect that countervails some of the effect of the initial increase in government spending. The second point is that when the interest rate goes up, it puts an upward pressure, an appreciative pressure on the exchange rate. That is, when your interest rate goes up, your domestic interest rate becomes higher than the depreciation adjusted foreign interest rate, and therefore you will experience capital inflows. Once you experience capital inflows, you'll have a balance of payments surplus. When you have a balance of payments surplus, the supply curve in the foreign exchange market shifts to the right. This will cause appreciative pressures to be exerted on the rupee-dollar parity. That is, the rupee will want to go from rupees 58 to the dollar to rupees 50 to the dollar. right? Now, when the rupee appreciates from 58 to 50, what do you think will be the impact of this on your exports? Exports will suffer because your competitiveness will suffer. Why will your competitiveness suffer? Because competitiveness is given by the real exchange rate. And the formula for that is simply the relative price ratio multiplied by the nominal exchange rate. So if the nominal exchange rate goes from 58 to 50, competitiveness or the real exchange rate goes down and your competitiveness goes down. And this causes your export sector to suffer. So X minus M falls. So a reduction in I and a reduction in X minus M is what causes or what prevents the increase in aggregate demand, the initial increase in government spending from causing a full output effect, a full income effect, Y1 to Y3. Now, I hope some of you had already started thinking on these lines that what would happen if the government increased the government spending, that is, there was a rightward shift in the IS curve, but we simultaneously increased the money supply to prevent the interest rate from rising, and therefore to prevent these crowding out effects, these crowding out of investment and net exports to take place, right? So when the IS curve shifts to the right, immediately the MS curve, the LM curve can be shifted to the right by an increase in money supply, and this can cause aggregate income or income to rise, equilibrium income to rise to the full extent. Let's see how this happens on a graph, and then let's see why a continuous cycle like this is not possible. That is why income can't be increased infinitely by a combination of expansionary fiscal and monetary policies. So what I'm talking about is this, my friends. We start at equilibrium point E naught, where the interest rate is I and equilibrium income is Y naught. Now, in the first instance, the government spends some money, which causes the IS curve to shift from IS1 to IS2. This takes us to equilibrium point E naught prime. However, if the fiscal policy and the monetary policy makers were coordinating their policies well, then the central bank would also increase the money supply at the same time that the government increased its fiscal expenditures. Therefore, the LM curve is shifted from LM1 to LM2. And this is to ensure that the interest rate does not rise, and therefore the full income effect can be realized. So we move from E naught prime then to E1. But this, you can argue, can happen again. That is, the government can undertake another fiscal expansion, which is represented by 3 here. That is the shift from IS2 to IS3. And a corresponding monetary expansion will take us to LM3, and the new intersection point is E2, and therefore income there increases to Y2. So, by having expansionary fiscal policies and expansionary monetary policies coordinated together, we can actually have a continuous cycle of increasing equilibrium income. Is this possible? No, my friends. Unfortunately, it is not possible. Otherwise, the task of the macroeconomic policymaker would be very simple. Why is it not possible? Because of rising prices. Note that we haven't talked about prices as yet. We've assumed prices are fixed. But prices are not fixed once there is no slack in the economy. That is, once you move beyond the aggregate supply, that part of the aggregate supply curve which is horizontal. So when the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, any increase in aggregate demand will cause an increase in prices. And note now that aggregate demand will increase not because just of an expansionary fiscal policy, but will also increase because of expansionary monetary policies. So note that after a while, when aggregate demand is increased by expansionary fiscal and monetary policies, prices will begin to rise. What will be the impact of prices? Well, the impact of prices will be twofold. The first impact of rising prices will hit aggregate demand. If you remember, we discussed the negative relationship between aggregate demand and prices. And we said that aggregate demand would fall when prices rise because of 3 effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the purchasing power, international purchasing power effects. Review those effects and you will understand why aggregate demand will fall. And this will cause the IS curve to shift back. So the IS curve that shifted to the right because of an increase in government spending will now shift back because of the three components of the price effect. Now the other impact of rising prices will be on the LM curve. Note that when we talk about the LM curve, we talked about real money supply and real money demand. What was real money supply and demand? We said that we would divide M by P, where P was the price level. So what happens when the price level rises? M over P falls. That is, there is a reduction in the real money supply. And this will cause the LM curve to shift backwards. So note that the rising prices have had a twofold or two-pronged effect. One, they have reduced or neutralized the increase in aggregate demand, and they have reduced the money supply, the real money supply in the economy. Let's see how this plays out graphically. Now, starting from E0, let's see what happens when there is an expansionary fiscal policy. IS1 moves to IS2, and equilibrium shifts from E0 to E1 when there is a monetary expansion as well. That is, LM1 shifts to LM2. So this was as in the previous case, when fiscal policy and monetary policy are coordinated. However, now that we've introduced rising prices, the impact of that on the IS curve will be to shift it back to IS1. And this will happen because of the wealth effect, which will hit consumption demand, because of the interest rate effect, which will hit investment demand, and because of the international purchasing power effect, which will hit net exports. So all those components of aggregate demand will suffer, and the IS curve will shift back to IS1. Note what happens to the LM curve. The LM curve will also shift inwards because the rising prices will cause M over P to fall, and therefore the real money supply to contract. And therefore equilibrium will fall or come back to E0 from E1. Now if Y0 was assumed as the full employment level of income, the point where the aggregate supply curve starts sloping upwards, or if Y0 was assumed as the natural rate of an employment level of output in monetarist terms, then indeed any increase in aggregate demand or any increase in government spending or the money supply would only cause an impact, a price impact. That is, prices would rise and there would be no output impact, and therefore you would move back to Y0, which was the full employment level of income. So that's a note about why expansionary fiscal policy and monetary policy cannot be employed continuously to cause permanent or continuous increases in equilibrium income. Let me also give you some concluding points about monetary and fiscal policies. One point is that through the IS-LM analysis, we can develop a better understanding of when fiscal policy is more effective and when monetary policy is more effective. To put it in a nutshell, when the LM curve is not very steep, that is, when the LM curve is flat, any rightward shift in the IS curve will cause a large output effect, right? So the fiscal policy will work best when the LM curve is flatter. Similarly, monetary policy works better when the IS curve is flatter. So any rightward shift in the LM curve will cause a large output or income effect. Let's illustrate this through some slides. So in this first diagram, we see what would happen when the LM curve is quite flat and there is an increase in government spending. As you can see, there is a large effect on income and only a small effect on interest rates. That is, a very large increase in income can be obtained without raising interest rates too much. That is, there is very little crowding out. On the other hand, you can see the case where monetary policy is more effective, and this happens when the IS curve is flatter. And as you can see, any increase in the money supply will cause a large increase in equilibrium income, and only a small interest rate reduction is needed to produce that large increase in equilibrium income. Note that you know something about the factors which cause the IS curve to be steep or flat. Similarly, you know about the factors which cause the LM curve to be steep or flat. The factors which cause the IS curve, that determine the slope of the IS curve are, yes, the size of the multiplier and the responsiveness of investment to changes in the interest rate. And the higher those two are, the flatter will be the IS curve, and that is when monetary policy will be more effective. On the other hand, what are the determinants of the slope of the LM curve? Yes, it's the responsiveness of money demand to changes in income, and it's the responsiveness of money demand to changes in the interest rates. And it's a combination of those which will determine whether the LM curve is steep or flat. And that is when you can tell whether the IS curve, whether fiscal policy will be more effective or not. So my friends, that's all that we have time for today. We have concluded discussion on monetary and fiscal policy. Perhaps one last point that you can take home with you is that fiscal policy, while it works very fast in reducing aggregate demand pressures in the economy, does take time to be revised. That is, the budget session only happens once a year. By contrast, monetary policy can be changed on a daily basis, but it takes time to impact the real economy because it works through the interest rate. And the impact of the interest rate on investment takes about a year and a half to 2 years to take place, because firms usually have their investment plans chalked out 2 or 3 years in advance. So when the interest rate changes, it takes time for firms' investment demand to change. So keeping that last point in mind, we will meet inshallah in our next lecture again, which will be on international trade and finance issues. Till then, it's Khuda Hafiz and Assalamu Alaikum.